The stars above were silent, but humanity never forgot the screams that once echoed across its colonies. The genocide was not a rumor, not a distant tragedy. It was a wound carved into the soul of the species. Cities reduced to ash. Families turned to shadows on burned walls. Entire generations erased in the blink of an alien fleet's guns. For years, the memory lingered like poison, and every survivor carried it inside them. The galaxy might have expected humans to plead for understanding, to bow their heads and choose peace. But after the genocide, humanity chose something else entirely: vengeance before diplomacy. It began in whispers. Survivors on broken space stations told their children of the day the skies turned red. Soldiers who had seen their comrades slaughtered swore never to let it happen again. Politicians stood in ruined halls, vowing that humanity would never forgive, never forget. And so, vengeance became more than an idea. It became the beating heart of a scattered species. Every ship rebuilt, every weapon reforged, every soldier trained was a step closer to justice. At least that's what the people believed. The galaxy watched carefully. Other civilizations, older and stronger, spoke of treaties, of peace talks, of reconciliation. They saw humanity's rising fleets and warned that vengeance would only bring ruin. But humans had already made their choice. To them, diplomacy without retribution was just surrender in another form. They would not sit at the table with those who had spilled their blood, not until that blood was answered for. Among the survivors were leaders who carried the weight of the genocide like iron chains. One was a commander who had stood helpless. As his homeworld burned, his family trapped beneath collapsing cities. Another was a scientist who lost her entire research colony in the first wave of fire. Her life's work erased along with everyone she loved. And there were countless others: pilots, refugees, children grown into soldiers, each one shaped by loss, each one ready to fight. They became the backbone of the new resolve. Their voices carried across the stars, calling humanity not to heal, but to strike. But vengeance was not just emotion, it was strategy. Humanity began to build weapons no one had seen before, fleets that could cloak in shadows, drones that hunted silently across the void, soldiers armed with technology born from desperation, fueled by fury. It wasn't just about defense anymore. It was about making sure those responsible felt the same fear that had once gripped humanity. Every engineer, every mechanic, every cadet on the training fields knew what their work meant. They weren't just preparing for war, they were preparing for reckoning. Still, not everyone agreed. There were voices that whispered of peace, of choosing another path. Some argued that vengeance would consume them, that it would turn humanity into the very monsters they despised. But those voices were drowned out by the roar of grief and anger. To most, peace without justice was an insult to the dead. And so the fleets grew larger, the soldiers grew harder, and the galaxy began to fear the fire humanity carried in its chest. The enemy who had once committed the genocide, the ones who thought humans would simply fade away, watched uneasily. They had underestimated before, believing humans were fragile, easily broken. But now they saw something else. Humanity was not fading, it was sharpening. Every scar became steel. Every grave became fuel. And though the galaxy spoke of caution, the enemy began to wonder if they had birthed a nightmare with their own hands. One night, aboard a hidden outpost orbiting the ruins of a dead world, the first true council of vengeance gathered. Commanders, soldiers, survivors, leaders, all sat together beneath the ghostly light of a shattered moon. They did not speak of treaties or rebuilding, they spoke of retribution, of how they would strike, where they would strike, and how to make sure the enemy understood what humanity had become. Their words were not cold. They burned with the heat of every lost soul. Yet beneath the fire there was something more. a question that no one dared to voice, but that hung heavy in the silence after every speech. If vengeance became the path, if humanity gave itself fully to retribution, what would be left of them afterward? Would they still be the same species that once dreamed of peace and discovery? Or would they become something else, something darker, something the galaxy would fear, not because of their tragedy, but because of what they chose to become? The decision was made anyway. The fleets would move, the soldiers would fight, the enemy would pay. Humanity's vengeance would be written across the stars, and no power in the galaxy could stop it. The commanders stood, their shadows long against, the ruins around them, and swore the oath together. Not one of them trembled, not one of them turned away. And so, the story begins. Not with diplomacy, not with peace, but with the sharp edge of vengeance carving through the silence of space. The first fleet readied itself, hidden in the dark between stars, engines humming low like the growl of a predator about to strike. The soldiers aboard checked their weapons, whispered the names of the dead, and steeled their hearts for what was to come. But as the engines flared to life, carrying humanity toward its first strike, something unexpected stirred in the shadows. A signal intercepted, a message that should not have existed. A fragment of communication that spoke not of war, but of something else. Something that could shatter everything humanity thought it knew about the genocide. A truth buried deep, waiting to be uncovered. And in that moment, the question returned, stronger than ever. Would humanity still choose vengeance if the truth was not what they believed? Or had the choice already been sealed no matter what came next? The fleets pushed forward into the dark, unaware of the revelation waiting ahead, unaware of the storm their vengeance would unleash, not just on their enemies, but on themselves. The stars held their breath, and the galaxy waited to see what humanity would become. Would they find justice, or would they burn everything in their path until nothing remained? The answer lay just beyond the horizon of war, where vengeance and truth were about to collide. And when it happened, the galaxy would never be the same again. The fleet moved in silence, drifting through the void like a hunting shadow. Each ship was a symbol of humanity's resolve, rebuilt from ruins, carrying the voices of the dead within. Its walls. The soldiers aboard were young and old, veterans and recruits, all bound by a single purpose. Some carried weapons for the first time, their hands shaking until training and anger steadied them. Others had fought in the first battles of survival, their eyes hardened by memories too heavy to share. Together they formed the spearhead of vengeance, but beneath the surface, doubts still stirred in whispers. The intercepted signal remained, locked in the hands of the high command. Few knew of it, and those who did struggled to make sense of what it implied. It was faint, broken, a fragment of language patched together from static. Yet in those broken words was the hint of something strange, voices not of an enemy boasting of conquest, but of hesitation, fear, and perhaps even regret. The possibility that the genocide had not been what it seemed lingered like a shadow behind every decision. But the commanders could not afford hesitation now, not with the fleets on the move. To speak of it openly would splinter the unity they had worked so hard to build. Still, among the ranks, stories traveled. Soldiers told each other about the intercepted transmission in secret, exaggerating, twisting, reshaping it until it became almost a legend of its own. Some said the enemy had acted under pressure from an unknown force. Others claimed it was a mistake of scale, an accident that spiraled into slaughter. And a few, the most bitter, rejected all of it as lies meant to weaken their resolve. For them, vengeance was not about truth. It was about making sure humanity was never powerless again. The commanders knew the danger. They remembered how easily doubt could unravel armies, how uncertainty could stall victory before the battle even began. So they pressed on, feeding their soldiers not with questions, but with reminders of the dead, of the ashes of colonies, and the silence of once living worlds. The speeches were simple, direct, and sharp. They told the soldiers to remember the screams, to carry that memory into every fight. And for most, it was enough. But the truth did not vanish. It lingered in the dark, just beyond reach. The scientist who had first decrypted the fragment could not stop listening to it. Night after night, she replayed the broken signal, her hands trembling as she tried to pull meaning from the chaos of noise. She had lost everything in the genocide, but part of her could not accept the possibility that it was random cruelty. She wanted to know why, and that question began to haunt her more than the memories of fire. Elsewhere in the fleet, a young soldier sat staring at a medal he had taken from the ruins of his homeworld. He had joined the fight out of duty, out of anger. But as the days stretched on, he found himself thinking about what his people had once been: builders, dreamers. They had reached for the stars not to conquer, but to explore. Now all he saw was fire in the eyes of his commanders. He wondered if humanity had already lost something vital, even before vengeance was carried out. He did not speak these doubts aloud, but they weighed on him like gravity. The enemy remained silent. No fleets appeared to challenge the humans. No envoys came to negotiate. To many, this silence was proof of guilt, proof that the enemy knew what was coming and feared it. But to others, it was unsettling. Why would a species capable of such destruction remain so quiet, letting humanity rebuild without interference? It was as though they were waiting, but for what, no one could say. The galaxy's other civilizations watched with unease, sending messages to humanity urging restraint. None of them were answered. In the council chambers aboard the flagship, maps of star systems glowed against the walls. Points of light marked colonies lost, others marked enemy strongholds, and one in particular pulsed brighter than the rest: the chosen target. It was not the enemy's capital, not yet. It was a fortress world, a place of industry and defense, meant to be untouchable. Humanity had chosen it for exactly that reason. They wanted to send a message. If the fortress could fall, nothing was safe. The plan was bold, dangerous, and costly. But to the commanders, cost no longer mattered. They believed humanity's survival demanded not just strength, but fear. The enemy had to learn that humans were no longer victims, and so preparations began in secret. Every soldier trained for the assault, every weapon calibrated for maximum devastation. And yet, the intercepted message remained. The scientist finally brought her findings to the council, her voice steady despite the storm of doubt inside her. She explained that the fragment suggested the genocide had not been ordered as a single act, but as the result of something more: fractured. Different voices, confusion, perhaps even division among the enemy's leaders. Her words were met with silence, and then with cold dismissal. The council told her what many already believed, that it did not matter. Whatever the reason, the dead could not return. Justice demanded action, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Not everyone in the chamber walked away convinced. One commander lingered after the meeting, staring at the maps, wondering what vengeance meant if the enemy's hands were not united. Would striking them bring justice, or would it ignite something even worse? He did not speak his doubt, not yet, but the thought stayed with him as the fleet drew closer to its target. The soldiers, unaware of these debates, prepared themselves with rituals of remembrance. Some carved names into the walls of their bunks. Others whispered prayers into the void. Some laughed too loudly, hiding fear behind bravado, and others sat in silence, staring at old photographs until their eyes burned. Every heart carried weight, and every mind was fixed on what was coming. Days stretched into weeks as the fleet traveled through the silent corridors of space. The chosen world loomed closer, hidden behind enemy patrols and defense grids. Each hour that passed brought the humans closer to their first strike. And with each hour, the intercepted signal whispered louder in the scientist's thoughts, urging her to search deeper, to find the truth before it was too late. But time was running out. The fleet was almost in position. Orders were ready. Weapons armed. The soldiers braced themselves for the storm to come. Humanity had chosen vengeance, and the galaxy watched as the first act of retribution drew near. And then, just before the fleet crossed into enemy territory, a new signal arrived. Stronger this time. Clearer. It was no fragment, no whisper. It was a message directed straight at them, and its first words froze every commander in place. It did not sound like the voice of an enemy. It sounded like a warning. The message echoed through the command chamber, carried on a frequency no human system should have been able to intercept. It wasn't a boast or a threat. It was something stranger, measured, urgent, almost desperate. The translation programs struggled with it, breaking the alien syllables into fragmented words, but the meaning was clear enough. Do not strike. You do not understand. The war is not what you believe. The commanders sat in silence as the words repeated, every one of them locked between instinct and uncertainty. They had prepared themselves for screams, for arrogance, for the sound of an enemy mocking them. Instead, they heard fear. The fleet did not stop. Engines still pulsed, weapons still charged, but now the question hung in the air heavier than before. What did it mean? If the enemy was warning them, not threatening them, then who truly held the strings behind the genocide? The scientist who had decrypted the first fragment now leaned closer to her console, her heart racing. This was what she had suspected all along, that something deeper had been buried beneath the fire, something that had twisted the truth. But would anyone listen before the assault began? Among the soldiers, rumors spread fast. Word of the new signal leaked through channels not meant for them, carried by whispers between decks and shared in hushed tones over rations. Some dismissed it instantly, saying it was nothing but a trick, an enemy ploy to weaken their resolve before the strike. Others weren't so sure. If the enemy truly feared humanity's attack, wouldn't they send fleets, not words? The uncertainty pressed down on them like a weight they couldn't shake, even as they trained harder, even as they prepared for the mission. On one of the smaller ships, a squad of young soldiers argued late into the night. One claimed that vengeance was the only way forward, that nothing could erase the sight of their families dying, that no message, no warning, could ever change what had been done. Another sat quietly, polishing a weapon that gleamed in the dim light, before finally whispering that maybe vengeance wasn't enough. Maybe the truth mattered more, even if it hurt to hear. The silence that followed was heavier than their words, and no one spoke again until morning. The commanders convened again, their faces drawn, their voices sharp with disagreement. Some insisted the signal was a lie, a manipulation designed to fracture them. Others argued that even if it was genuine, the path had already been chosen. Humanity had united around vengeance, and to hesitate now would make them look weak. But one commander, the same who had doubted before, finally spoke louder than the rest. He reminded them that humanity had always sought knowledge, that the drive to understand had carried them to the stars. To abandon that now, to blind themselves with rage, could destroy them more completely than any enemy fleet. His words found no easy answer, but they lingered, refusing to fade. Meanwhile, the scientist dug deeper. The new signal carried data hidden beneath the words, fragments of coordinates, layers of encrypted markers. She worked tirelessly to decode them, sleepless and restless, until finally the shapes of star systems emerged on her screen. These were not the positions of enemy strongholds, they were something else. Places where the enemy's colonies had been destroyed by weapons that didn't match human design. The implication was chilling. If the genocide had been the work of something greater, something outside the war humans believed they were fighting, then the path they were on might not just be vengeance. It might be walking straight into another trap. The galaxy, distant and cautious, continued to watch. Other civilizations sent warnings again, urging humanity to pause, to reconsider, to seek truth before fire. But the humans ignored them. The people demanded action, demanded retribution, and the commanders knew that their power rested on the will of those they led. To admit hesitation now would risk unraveling everything they had built. And yet, in private, the doubts grew louder. The fortress world loomed closer. Recon ships reported massive defenses, fleets of enemy ships anchored in orbit, vast networks of weapons spread across the surface. It was everything humanity had prepared for, an enemy stronghold bristling with firepower, daring them to attack. But even here, something seemed wrong. The defenses were active, yes, but the enemy fleets made no move to intercept. They just waited, their formation rigid, their silence suffocating. Some of the younger commanders whispered that it looked more like a shield than a sword, as though the enemy were guarding something behind them rather than preparing to strike. Subplots unfolded across the fleet. On one ship, a medic who had once been a teacher found herself comforting soldiers who dreamed of their lost homes. She told them stories of Earth's past, of how humanity had endured hardship and found ways to rise again, reminding them that survival was not only about fire but about holding on to what made them human. Her words spread quietly among the soldiers, softening their anger into reflection, though never enough to break their resolve. On another vessel, an engineer uncovered strange activity in the fleet's communication array. The intercepted signals were not just coming from outside. There were echoes inside the human fleet itself, almost as if someone among them was amplifying or relaying the alien transmissions. The discovery was buried quickly by the higher command, but it raised new fears. Was there a traitor among them? Or had the enemy's message seeded division in ways they could not control? The commanders, pressed by time and the eyes of their soldiers, finally gave the order to proceed. The strike would begin in days. Humanity would not wait any longer. But in those final days, tension wound tighter than ever. The scientist begged for more time to decode the signals, to piece together the truth. The commanders refused, though some avoided her gaze as they walked away. Soldiers sharpened their blades and charged their rifles. But in the quiet between drills, some stared into the void, wondering if the vengeance they carried was as simple as they wanted it to be. And then, on the eve of battle, the enemy finally moved. Not with fleets, not with weapons, but with something far stranger. A single ship, unarmed, broke from the fortress world's orbit and drifted slowly toward the human fleet. Its lights were dim, its signals faint, but its approach was steady, unthreatening. The humans prepared to fire, to erase it before it came too close. Yet just before the order was given, the ship broadcast the same warning as before. Only now, it was clear, direct, undeniable. The war is not yours to fight. You do not see who pulls the strings. If you strike here, you will awaken what even we fear. The message was repeated over and over, and every soldier, every commander, every survivor who had sworn to vengeance felt the chill of uncertainty cut through their fury. The fortress world no longer looked like a symbol of power to be destroyed. It looked like a prison, and as the unarmed ship drifted closer, humanity stood balanced on the edge of its choice, vengeance or truth, knowing that whichever they chose would change not just the war, but the fate of their entire species. The unarmed ship drifted closer through the dark, its hull scarred, its engines burning weak and uneven. The human fleet tracked it with weapons locked, every cannon, every missile ready to erase it from existence with a single command. Soldiers stood at their posts, hands tightening around triggers, waiting for the order. Yet none came. The silence on the command deck stretched longer than anyone expected, broken only by the steady pulse of the alien transmission. Over and over, the message repeated, each word sinking deeper into the minds of those who listened. If you strike, you will awaken what even we fear. No one moved, but tension crackled in the air like static. The commanders debated in hurried voices, some insisting the ship should be destroyed before it could come closer, others demanding they board it to uncover the truth. Fear warred with anger in their words, the same conflict that now spread through the entire fleet. To many soldiers, the alien craft was a trap waiting to spring. But to others, it was the first real sign that the story of the genocide was not as simple as it had seemed. The scientist pressed for the ship to be intercepted rather than destroyed. Her voice shook, but did not falter as she reminded the commanders of the coordinates she had decoded, of the hidden truth she believed was buried behind the fire. She argued that if humanity destroyed this vessel, they might destroy their only chance to understand what had truly happened. Some commanders scoffed, dismissing her plea as weakness, but others listened, their silence betraying cracks in their certainty. The alien vessel sent no weapons online, launched no countermeasures, did nothing but continue its slow, steady approach. And then, as though the silence itself could no longer contain the tension, the enemy fortress stirred. Lights flashed across its surface, massive arrays shifting, fleets breaking formation. Soldiers gasped as the readings poured in, not weapons being primed, but power signatures rising from deep within the planet's crust. Something was being contained below the surface, something vast, something old, and something powerful enough to terrify the very species humanity had sworn to annihilate. The words of the alien message now carried a different weight. You do not see who pulls the strings. The scientist leaned over her console, her fingers flying across keys as she magnified the signals. The energy readings matched neither human nor enemy design. It was something else entirely. A third hand in the war, hidden until now, buried beneath the ground of a world that was meant to look like a fortress, but was something far worse. Lock. On the lower decks of the fleet, soldiers felt the shift in atmosphere even before the official orders were spoken. Fear cut through their anger, but so did determination. Some whispered that it didn't matter what was beneath the surface. The enemy had committed genocide, and they deserved to fall regardless. Others argued in desperate voices that this wasn't their fight anymore, that they had been pulled into a war that might consume them all. The arguments nearly erupted into violence in one barracks, until a veteran silenced them by pounding his fist against the steel wall. He told them that whatever choice was made, it would define not just the battle, but the soul of humanity. His words lingered long after he left the room. The unarmed ship finally came to a halt just outside the human fleet's formation. A single transmission followed, clearer than any before. It was not words this time, but an image. Holograms filled the command deck, showing not only the destruction of human colonies, but the destruction of countless others, alien worlds burned and broken by the same hand. Not just humans, not just their enemy. Entire species, wiped out by something greater, something neither side fully controlled. The genocide humanity had endured was part of a pattern, a chain of destruction stretching across centuries. The commanders sat frozen as the images played. Worlds unknown, faces of alien children crying before fire erased them, fleets breaking under unseen weapons. Humanity was not the only victim, and suddenly, vengeance felt both justified and small, a single piece of a story far larger than anyone had imagined. Still, the decision loomed. The fleets were in position. The soldiers waited for the order. The fortress world below stirred with the rising power of whatever was contained within, and the enemy ship, weak and fragile before them, waited for an answer. Outside, the soldiers could feel the tension building. The fortress planet's crust trembled as massive energy spikes shook their sensors. Drones sent closer to the surface transmitted brief glimpses of titanic structures buried beneath rock. And steel, their designs alien and ancient, older than either humanity or their enemy. Some soldiers stared at the readings in awe, while others gripped their weapons tighter, convinced that this was proof the enemy had always been hiding something monstrous. The scientist worked tirelessly, sweat streaking down her face as she decoded the last fragments of the alien message, and when she finally cracked it, her voice broke with urgency. The fortress wasn't just a prison, it was a seal. If destroyed, it would release something vast into the galaxy, something that had manipulated both species into slaughtering each other so it could remain hidden. Her warning reached the commanders just as the fleet received final orders to arm for the strike. The contradiction was unbearable. Soldiers readied their weapons, believing they were seconds from vengeance, while in the command chamber, leaders faced the most impossible decision humanity had ever encountered. Strike, and they might unleash a nightmare. Hold back, and they might lose the unity that had carried them this far. As the debate raged, the enemy fortress opened fire, but the shots were not aimed at the human fleet. They were fired downward into their own planet's crust, trying to suppress the rising energy. The humans watched in shock as the enemy sacrificed their own defenses, their own soldiers, to keep whatever was buried from breaking free. For the first time, humanity saw their enemy not as executioners, but as desperate jailers fighting against something greater. And still, the order to strike remained on the edge of being spoken. The fleet's weapons were primed. The soldiers stood ready. The scientist shouted her warnings into a silence too heavy to hear. The unarmed ship broadcast one final desperate plea. The planet below trembled harder, its surface cracking as light bled into the dark sky. In that moment, every heart across the fleet seemed to stop. Humanity was balanced between two choices, each carrying a price too great to measure: strike, and risk unleashing an ancient terror. Hold, and risk betraying the oath they had sworn to the dead. The fortress shook violently. Sensors screamed with overloads. The enemy fleet broke formation in panic. The unarmed ship lit up with signals brighter than ever, as if begging humanity to decide. And aboard the flagship, the commander raised his hand, ready to give the final order that would decide not only the battle, but the future of every living soul in the galaxy. Would humanity choose vengeance, or would they listen to the warning? The answer hung in the silence of space, waiting to be spoken. The commander's hand hovered in the air. The silence of the fleet stretched so tight it felt ready to break. Soldiers waited for the word that would unleash fire across the fortress world, every weapon charged, every mind braced for vengeance. The scientist stood trembling at her console, her voice raw from shouting warnings that too many ignored. The enemy fortress shook violently, light bleeding from the cracks in its surface as its own fleets fired downward to suppress the power beneath. Humanity was seconds from a decision that could define its future forever. And then, the second twist came. From the far side of the system, sensors picked up movement. At first, it seemed like another enemy fleet, massive in scale, approaching fast. But as the images cleared, shock rippled through the command decks. These ships were not enemy, and they were not human either. They were something else entirely, designs alien, hulls etched with strange patterns that shimmered like living things, technology that no one had ever seen before. They arrived in silence, their formation perfect, their numbers overwhelming. Whoever they were, they had been waiting for this moment. The fleet erupted in confusion. Soldiers whispered in fear as new data poured in. Commanders shouted orders just to keep their people steady. The scientist stared at the readings, her heart racing as realization struck. This was the third force, the unseen hand behind the genocide, the shadow that had used both humans and their enemy as pawns in a far larger game. The warning had been true. Something older, something hidden, had finally stepped into the open. The alien fleet did not attack immediately. Instead, they broadcast a signal that drowned out everything else. The translation systems strained, and Then a voice filled the ships of both human and enemy alike. Calm, cold, certain. The seal must be broken. The cycle must continue. Resistance will be erased. The words were enough to silence every argument, enough to chill even the most hardened soldiers. It was not a threat born of arrogance. It was a declaration, as though this fleet had done this before, countless times, across countless stars. And then, as if to prove their words, the alien fleet opened fire, not on humans, not on their enemy, but directly on the planet below. The fortress world erupted with blasts of unimaginable power as the new fleet's weapons hammered the crust. The energy below surged higher, breaking through the cracks, tearing the planet's surface apart. The enemy's ships fought desperately, sacrificing themselves to block the incoming fire, their formations collapsing as they threw everything into protecting the seal. For the first time, humanity saw their enemy in a new light, not as conquerors, but as guardians standing against something far greater. Chaos consumed the human fleet. Some commanders shouted to fire on the fortress anyway, believing that vengeance must be carried out no matter what. Others screamed that they needed to turn their weapons against the new fleet before it was too late. Soldiers stared in disbelief, their oath of vengeance twisted into something unrecognizable. They had prepared for one enemy, but now stood caught between two forces, each demanding a different kind of survival. The scientist begged the council to act, to unite with their former enemy against the greater threat. She reminded them that humanity had always adapted, always found ways to turn impossible odds into victory. But she also knew her words might not be enough. Too many hearts still burned for revenge, too many voices demanded blood, not alliance. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. The genocide that had scarred humanity was not the act of a single enemy. They had been manipulated, pushed into conflict to weaken both sides, just as the ancient fleet had planned. The fortress world shuddered again, its surface splitting wide as molten light burst into space. Fragments of the planet cracked loose, drifting upward in a deadly halo. From the rift below, sensors picked up structures rising, vast, mechanical, and alive with power. Whatever had been locked beneath the crust was awakening. Soldiers who saw the readings whispered in dread, their voices shaking as they spoke of ancient gods, of something that should never have been disturbed. In the midst of the chaos, one squad of human soldiers received a desperate order. Their ship was to intercept the unarmed vessel that had approached earlier, to board it, and to bring back whatever information it carried. They moved quickly, boarding pods streaking across the void, latching onto the alien hull. The soldiers entered expecting traps, but what they found shook them more than any ambush could. The interior of the ship was filled with evidence, archives, recordings, histories stretching back centuries. The aliens who crewed it were weak, malnourished, but not hostile. They showed the soldiers what humanity had never seen before. Proof that the ancient fleet had been engineering genocides across the galaxy for generations, always pitting one species against another, always striking when the survivors were weakest, ensuring no civilization could ever rise strong enough to challenge them. Humanity had been caught in just one chapter of a cycle that stretched back farther than anyone could imagine. Back on the flagship, the commanders received the report. Arguments erupted once more, louder, sharper, until it seemed the council itself might fracture into violence. The choice was no longer between vengeance and diplomacy. It was between clinging to rage and facing extinction. To ally with their sworn enemy was unthinkable to many, yet to stand alone against the ancient fleet was suicide, and still no resolution came. Outside, the ancient ships pressed their attack. The planet below began to collapse inward, not exploding, outward but folding into itself, as though the very laws of physics bent to whatever was being unleashed. The energy readings spiked beyond comprehension, threatening to tear apart not just the fortress world but the entire system. Time was running out. The enemy's remaining fleets shifted, forming a desperate shield wall around both their world and the human fleet. Their actions spoke louder than any words. They were protecting humanity as well as themselves, hoping against all odds to hold back the ancient armada. Soldiers aboard human ships watched in stunned silence as alien vessels sacrificed themselves, burning in fire that was not meant for them. The lines between friend and foe blurred, and with it, the certainty of vengeance. The commander who had once doubted the path of vengeance stood again, his voice steady, even as the chamber shook with alarms. He said that humanity had a choice to make, not just for themselves, but for the galaxy. They could cling to the past, or they could rise to face the true enemy. He asked if vengeance mattered more than survival, more than truth, more than the future of their species. His words struck like iron, but still the decision did not come easily. The scientist looked out the viewport, her reflection caught against the sight of the collapsing planet. She thought of the families lost, the voices silenced, the homes burned to ash. But she also thought of the greater pattern, of the other species erased long before humanity ever reached the stars. If they chose vengeance now, they would only become another forgotten name, another dead civilization lost in the cycle. The alarms blared louder as the ancient fleet's weapons turned toward the humans. The fortress planet's surface tore open, revealing a rising structure that glowed like the heart of a dying star. Soldiers gripped their weapons, commanders shouted orders, engines roared to life. The moment of choice was upon them, and the stakes had never been higher. Would humanity hold to vengeance, even if it meant extinction? Or would they seize the chance to rewrite their fate, even if it meant standing with the enemy they had sworn to destroy? The commander's hand hovered again, every eye in the fleet fixed on him, every heart braced for the words that would either doom them or give them a fighting chance. And just before he spoke, the ancient fleet broadcast one final message, simple and cold. The cycle ends with you. The commander's hand lowered slowly, but not with the order the soldiers had expected. Instead of commanding fire on the enemy fortress, his voice cut through the silence with words no one thought they would ever hear. He ordered the human fleet to turn its weapons, not on the fortress, not on their old enemy, but on the new arrival, the ancient fleet that had revealed itself. The chamber erupted in disbelief, officers shouting over one another, soldiers questioning their orders, but the commander's voice rose above the chaos. Humanity would not let itself be erased. If the ancient armada had orchestrated their suffering, then humanity's vengeance would not be misdirected anymore. The dead deserved truth, and the living deserved survival. The fleet roared to life. Engines surged, weapons locked, and for the first time, human ships and their old enemies moved in the same direction. The alien fortress's remaining fleets shifted, realigning with the humans, their shields opening to cover the combined forces. The scientist whispered to herself that history had changed in that instant, that humanity had done what no other species had managed before. They had broken the cycle. But breaking the cycle came at a cost. The ancient fleet outnumbered them by thousands, their weapons unlike anything humans or their former enemies had faced. The first clash tore through the system like a storm. The ancient ships unleashed beams of energy that bent around shields and pierced hulls with terrifying precision. Human destroyers disintegrated in seconds, their crews barely able to scream before fire consumed them. Enemy cruisers, once feared across the galaxy, now stood shoulder to shoulder with human vessels, burning in the same inferno, falling in the same silence. The alliance was fragile, desperate, but it held. For every human ship destroyed, the enemy sacrificed two of their own, as if trying to prove with blood that they were no longer executioners, but comrades in survival. The scientist worked furiously at her console, tracking the energy signatures from the fortress world below. She realized the rising structure was not just a weapon, but a core linked to the ancient fleet itself. If it broke free, the battle would be lost before it began. But if humanity and their allies could disrupt it, there might be a chance. She transmitted the data to the commanders, her voice urgent. The plan became clear. Strike the rising structure. Not to release it, but to collapse it back into its prison before it could fully awaken. The soldiers received the order and steeled themselves. Boarding parties were launched toward the cracking surface, human and alien troops fighting side by side on burning fields of stone and metal. They faced horrors spilling from the rifts, constructs of energy and machinery, guardians older than civilizations, designed to protect the prison at all costs. Men and women who had sworn vengeance against the aliens now fought with them at their side, their rifles spitting fire at a common enemy. In the chaos, lines blurred completely. There was no human and no alien, only survivors locked in a desperate fight against extinction. The commander watched from the flagship as the fortress below bled light into the sky. Every decision he had made weighed on him. Every life lost pulling at his conscience. But he could not falter now. Humanity had been broken before. But in this moment, they stood at the heart of history. They would either rise to define the galaxy or fall into silence forever. His order was simple and final. All fleets concentrate fire on the rising structure. The combined armada unleashed its fury. Missiles streaked through the void. Energy beams cracked the heavens. Plasma fire lit the darkness. The planet groaned. Under the weight of the assault, its crust shattering further, its prisons straining to contain what had already begun to awaken. For a moment, it seemed like they might succeed. The ancient fleet faltered, their formation breaking as they moved. Desperately to defend the structure, the humans and their new allies pressed harder, driving them back inch by inch. And then the twist came. The structure did not collapse. Instead, it pulsed with new energy, brighter than any weapon, brighter than any star. The scientist's heart froze as she read the signals. The prison wasn't weakening, it was feeding. The combined assault had given it power, had accelerated its awakening. The ancient fleet had never been trying to release it. They had been trying to contain it. The humans and their allies had played into the trap, and now the true enemy was rising, fueled by their own rage. From the cracks in the planet, a colossal shape emerged. It was not a fleet, not a machine, not anything that could be described in familiar terms. It was a vast intelligence, a living construct, its form shifting between energy and matter. It reached into the minds of every soldier, every commander, every survivor, speaking without words, pressing terror into their hearts. It was the architect of the cycle, the force that had orchestrated genocides across the galaxy to maintain control. And now it was free. The human fleet wavered. Soldiers trembled as the presence filled their minds, whispering promises, showing visions of lost families returned, of vengeance satisfied, of peace offered in exchange for surrender. The scientist cried out that it was lies, manipulations, designed to break their will. But the pressure was crushing. Some ships faltered, their weapons going silent, their crews paralyzed by the voice of the ancient entity. But then something unexpected happened. The enemy, the very species humanity had once sworn to destroy, moved first. Their flagship surged forward, breaking formation, charging directly at the rising construct. They transmitted a single message across all channels, words every human could understand. We were wrong. You were wrong. But this thing cannot be allowed to live. And then their ship rammed the construct, detonating its core in a blinding wave of fire. The explosion shook the system, ripping apart both the construct and the alien flagship. For a moment, silence returned. The construct staggered, weakened, its form flickering, no longer unbreakable. The scientist shouted into the chaos, urging the humans to press now, to finish it before it could recover. And so, the human fleet unleashed everything it had left. The climax roared through the void. Every missile, every beam, every ounce of fury humanity had carried since the genocide was unleashed, not on their old enemy, but on the true architect of their suffering. The construct screamed in their minds, its form unraveling under the storm. The fortress world collapsed beneath it, tearing apart in a final implosion that consumed the prison, the construct, and much of the ancient fleet. When the light faded, silence returned to the stars. Wreckage drifted everywhere. Human ships burned, beside alien ships, but together they had done the impossible. The cycle had been broken. The true enemy had been destroyed. Humanity had chosen not blind vengeance, but survival with truth. And then, just as relief began to spread, the twist revealed itself. A final transmission cut through the void, not from the construct, not from the ancient fleet, but from deeper space. A voice, identical to the one they had just silenced, whispered a single phrase across every channel: "The cycle never ends." This was only one of us. The fleet froze, the survivors staring into the endless dark beyond their ruined battlefield. Humanity had won, but the war was only beginning. The battlefield drifted in silence after the last explosion, the ruins of ships, human and alien alike, scattered across the void. Fires flickered within broken hulls, slowly dying out as the cold of space consumed them. The survivors sat in stunned quiet, listening to the static of failing communications and the soft cries of those who had lost too much to even speak. Humanity had stood on the edge of extinction and fought back, but victory did not bring celebration. It brought the weight of what had been revealed, the shadow of something larger still waiting in the dark. The final transmission echoed again, in their minds. The cycle never ends. This was only one of us. The words carried no anger, only certainty, and that was what made them most terrifying. Humanity had believed the construct to be the mastermind behind the genocides, the architect of their pain. Destroying it should have been the end. Instead, it had been only the beginning. There were more. The cycle stretched farther than anyone had imagined, and the galaxy was far from safe. The scientist sat alone at her console, staring at the last fragments of data she had recorded before the construct fell. The readings were scattered, incomplete. But one detail stood out: signals moving far beyond the edge of known space, patterns that mirrored the construct's energy but came from other directions. She knew instantly what it meant. Humanity had only cut off one hand of a much larger force. Somewhere out there, the others were still watching. On the flagship, the commander walked through the halls, his steps heavy as the wounded and weary saluted him. He did not feel like a leader. He felt like a survivor who had stumbled through fire, carrying the burden of every life lost under his command. He knew that many had doubted his decision to ally with their former enemy, but without that choice, none of them would be alive. Still, he also knew that unity would not last. Already whispers spread among the soldiers, some refusing to forgive the aliens for the genocide, others shaken by the realization that they had been fighting the wrong war all along. In the barracks, soldiers gathered in small groups, tending to wounds both visible and invisible. One young soldier who had once argued that vengeance was all that mattered now sat quietly, staring at the alien comrade who had saved his life during the assault. He did not know how to reconcile the rage that had carried him this far with the gratitude he now felt. Another soldier clutched the metal from his ruined world, whispering to himself that vengeance had not been denied. It had simply been redirected. The dead had not been avenged through blind destruction, but through the breaking of the cycle itself. The enemy survivors were no less shaken. Their fleets had been torn apart, their fortress world destroyed, yet for the first time they had fought alongside another species rather than against one. They, too, had lost countless lives, and for them the shame of past atrocities weighed heavily. Some humans demanded retribution still, demanding the aliens pay for what had been done to humanity before the truth was revealed. Others argued that punishing them now would undo everything gained in the battle. The conflict ran deep, but the galaxy had changed. Both sides had stared into the same abyss, and neither could deny what they had seen. The scientist brought her findings to the council. Her voice tired but unshaken, she explained what the data revealed, that more of the ancient constructs existed, scattered across the galaxy, each sealed within worlds disguised as fortresses or colonies. She told them the cycle was designed to keep civilizations weak, always, turning on each other, never growing strong enough to challenge the hidden masters. Humanity's survival meant they had broken one link in that chain, but more remained. The council sat in silence. No one spoke of vengeance anymore. No one spoke of diplomacy either. The choice before them was far heavier: to retreat and rebuild, hoping the cycle would not find them again, or to prepare for the next battle, to face the hidden enemy head-on before it struck again. Humanity had been dragged into this war unwillingly, but now they had a choice to make for themselves. The commander rose and addressed the council, his words slow and steady. He reminded them that humanity had always been underestimated. The genocide had been meant to erase them, but instead, it had hardened them. They had faced the greatest terror in the galaxy and survived. He told them that survival was not enough anymore. Humanity could not wait for the cycle to strike again. They had to be the ones to break it for good. His words carried through the fleet, reaching soldiers who had lost faith, reaching survivors who had only anger left in them. Slowly, the idea spread, not of vengeance, not of simple survival, but of purpose. Humanity had been scarred, but those scars now gave them strength. They would not fight for rage alone anymore. They would fight to end the cycle, not just for themselves, but for every species that had fallen before, and everyone that might rise after. The scientist stood with him, her voice quieter but no less certain. She said the dead had been honored not by vengeance, but by truth. By seeing the real enemy and standing against it, humanity had given meaning to the loss. The cycle had thrived because civilizations always turned on each other, always fought the wrong wars. But humanity had done what none before them had managed. They had seen through the deception, even if only at the edge of destruction. In the weeks that followed, the fleets drifted back to safer systems. Survivors rebuilt what they could, salvaging wreckage, burying the dead, patching the broken ships that still remained. Human and alien engineers worked side by side, though mistrust lingered. The old wounds would not vanish overnight, but the war had forced them into a new reality. Neither could survive alone. The galaxy had been too divided for too long, and that division was the very weapon the cycle had always relied on. The young soldier who once carried only rage found himself writing a letter to the families of the fallen, not promising vengeance, but promising truth. That their sacrifice had not been meaningless, that humanity now knew who the true enemy was. He did not know if it would ease their grief, but it eased his. For the first time, he felt his anger turn into resolve. The commander stood once more on the deck of the flagship, staring out at the stars. They no longer looked like a battlefield, waiting to be claimed, but like a path forward, endless and dangerous. The war was not over. It might never be over, but humanity had taken the first step away from being pawns. They had chosen their own path, one built not only on vengeance, but on vision. The final unexpected truth lingered in everyone's mind. There were more constructs, more voices in the dark, more cycles waiting to be unleashed. The battle had been won, but the war stretched far beyond what anyone had imagined. Humanity had not ended it, but they had changed the rules. The cycle was no longer unbroken. As the fleets prepared for the long journey home, the scientist stood with the commander. and whispered the words that would carry them forward. Humanity had survived the genocide not by chance, but by choice. They had chosen to rise from the ashes, to see beyond their pain, and to fight for something greater than vengeance. The story of humanity was no longer just about loss. It was about defiance. It was about refusing to be broken, refusing to be manipulated, refusing to fade quietly into history. The cycle had underestimated them. The galaxy had underestimated them. But humanity was ready, and as the ships turned toward the stars, battered but unyielding, every survivor carried the same thought into the dark. The cycle might never end on its own, but humanity would make sure this time it would.